Oral questions by members.
Member for Skeena.
All the right words have been said since the armed attack on a Coastal GasLink worksite. But this action was just the latest escalation of violence. This government has allowed a legally approved project supported by First Nations all along Highway 16 and down channel, including the Gitga'at Nation and Kitkatla, to be repeatedly harassed and delayed. The Wet'suwet'en First Nation, which the province has ignored for the past several years, has issued this statement. Quote, "We call on those who are inviting violent non-Wet'suwet'en people into our territories to withdraw their invitations. We call on their supporters, wherever they are, to stop funding criminal protests and to stop trespassing on our traditional lands." End quote. So my question is to the Premier. When will the Premier stop these protests and get this project completed?
Member for Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation.
Thank you. Thank you, Honourable Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member opposite for the question. Clearly, this is a difficult time for all of us in British Columbia. Workers deserve to be safe at their place of employment. As the member indicated, during the early morning hours of February 17th, approximately 20 masked and violent attackers wearing camouflage surrounded and attacked Coastal GasLink workers near Houston, British Columbia. They wielded axes, swinging them at vehicles and through a truck's window, and fired flare guns at workers. Mr. Speaker, workers deserve to be safe at work. The attack is absolutely reprehensible. It's a serious and violent criminal act, and our government has emphatically condemned it, as have members from all sides of this House. The member knows that the RCMP is conducting a thorough investigation to identify and apprehend those responsible. I suggest the members opposite should allow the police to conduct that investigation.
Member for Skeena, supplemental.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And here's the problem. Just like the last incident, nice words don't match the actions. Doug Donaldson, the then minister for this government, stood on the line and provided support for these protesters. The member for Sakine wrote a letter complaining the RCMP were too mean when workers were basically being held hostage by protesters. This government has consistently ignored and disrespected elected chief and councils, letting the protesters know that this government has their back. This isn't just about denouncing violence or reciting what was read in the newspaper. That's obvious. This is about ensuring the rule of law, and more importantly, ensuring that the rule of law is followed, something that this government has completely failed to do. So my question to the Premier, will the Premier finally support the First Nations along the route and ensure that this LNG export project proceeds smoothly?
Minister. Thank you, Honourable Speaker. We make absolutely no assumptions as to who was involved in this event. It's a reprehensible criminal act that the RCMP are investigating, as everyone would expect that they would. We have no idea at this stage who was involved in this reprehensible act. I have spoken with Chief Luggie of the Wet'suwet'en First Nation. I note that she made a statement. I note that the carrier Sekani made a statement. We are reaching out to all sides of this dispute, but nevertheless, Mr. Speaker, we have work to do, and we will continue to do that work.
Member for Skeena, second supplemental.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And you know what? The issue is actually not the violent attack in itself. We know the RCMP have a job to do. This is the issue of government allowing this to happen over the last 5 years. This is the issue of actually supporting these actions on the pipeline itself. This is the issue of this government allowing the actions to escalate to the point where workers were put in danger, to the point where RCMP, again, were put in danger. It's not the first time an RCMP member has gotten hurt on his site. We know the RCMP will do their job and investigate. What we're asking about, will the government actually do its job and allow this project to succeed and stop supporting these violent escalations? We have a Minister of the Crown who is supposed to be taking over a new ministry responsible for the, and I quote, the co-management of land and resources of First Nations, end quote. This same minister has been criticizing the RCMP for their efforts to resolve this crisis. Now we're supposed to believe that the Minister of State for Lands and Natural Resources was wearing a different hat when it comes to resolving these violent attacks on Coastal GasLink workers. Just like the Minister of Citizen Services, he continues to evade and rely on technicalities to have it both ways. To the Minister of State, how can we continue to believe that this government and this minister won't keep trying to have it both ways now that this conflict has turned violent?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, through you to the honourable member, we do not jump to conclusions, and I would urge all members not to do so as well. We do not know what happened. That is in the hands of the RCMP. This is a serious, heinous criminal act that has been committed. We accept that. We also understand, to the member's point, that the CGL project has the relevant permits. We are doing what we can in this regard. We have been negotiating with the proper rights and title holder. We would hope we can do so as well. This act is something that should be left to the RCMP. We should not jump to conclusions in this place.
Leader of the Official Opposition.
Well, thank you very much. And to the Minister, it's about how the conditions have been allowed to evolve. It's fine to have words now, but over and over again, this government was missing in action. But when they weren't missing in action, let's take a look at the failures of the Minister of State for Lands on this file. Certainly no one can forget his comments about Roy Jones Jr., a hereditary chief of the Haida, and Anita McPhee of the Tahltan. Those were words not forgotten. On February the 10th, 2019, here's what the Minister of State said, and I quote, "If CGL proceeds before the issues of rights and title of the Wet'suwet'en have been sorted, we will be throwing their rights away," end quote. He was then paid $250 an hour to do that, but failed to accomplish anything. Yet when things get messy between those who oppose the pipeline and elected leaders who support it, he sided with the protesters. So much for the words of the minister previously. He sided with the protesters, as he did in December, when what did he do? He wrote a letter criticizing the RCMP. So does the Minister of State take any responsibility at all for his failure to accomplish anything other than collecting over $100,000 of taxpayer money?
Minister of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation. Thank you very much, Honourable Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member opposite for this question. I think we all agree that this is an extremely complex issue. We're trying to balance provincial law with Wet'suwet'en law. We are trying to do so in the context of an approved project through their traditional territory. We're trying to address the implications of colonialism, the issue of the Delgamuukw decision, which for so long has been ignored by governments. We are trying to put meat on the bones of that decision, to do what we should have done 25 years ago. And it's hard, Mr. Speaker. It is very difficult. We acknowledge that. And there have been incidents in the territory. But that doesn't mean we should stop this historic work. It means we should accelerate it. We should get on with this work. We are urging our partners to do so as well. We have met with the elected chiefs. We have met with the hereditary chiefs. We've been invited to the territory back in September, which we did, to meet with the hereditary chiefs. We have work to do, the federal government and the provincial government, and Mr. Speaker, we will not be deterred. We will continue to do this historic work.
Leader of the Official Opposition, supplemental.
Well, I think the part the minister missed was that the NDP have mishandled this file from the beginning. And let's be clear, the Minister of State was missing in action outside the House, and apparently he's missing in action in the House today, instead of standing up and actually explaining why he sided with protesters. That's on his watch. Those are his words. And you bet the people of British Columbia expect this government to do something. Let's just look at the fact that 2 NDP cabinet ministers were paid over $246,000 to work on this complicated problem. No one is suggesting that governing isn't hard and that this isn't a complex issue. But an MOU was signed over 2 years ago that was described at the time as historic and that it was a momentous agreement. But guess what? It had specific timelines that have been completely missed. Completely missed. Not only that, it was also an agreement that ignored the elected Wet'suwet'en leadership and didn't in any way, shape, or form address the issues of protests or blockades. And as we've said numerous times, in fact, the Minister of State stood on the side of protesters. So will someone, anyone on that side of the House, take responsibility for the situation we find ourselves in and their complete failure to achieve any resolution at all?
Minister. Minister.
Thanks very much, Mr. Speaker. The former government decided to negotiate solely with the elected chiefs. Our government decided to work with the proper rights and title holder as determined by the Supreme Court of Canada. But we are still also trying to engage with the elected chiefs. I have spoken with every single one of them, I believe, or at least attempted to. I'm speaking with Chief Lughi, I think later today or certainly this week. I continue to reach out to Chief Nakal of Whitsett. I continue to try to work with them, just as I'm trying to achieve unity. But ultimately, that's for the Wet'suwet'en people to do. That nation has to figure it out. We've provided resources to help them on that journey. We are going to work with the federal government to implement the MOU that was signed. Perhaps the members have forgotten that there was a few problems over the last year that might have been one of the reasons for the delay that I agree has occurred. Yes, the timelines have been missed, but COVID had something to do with that. The ability to negotiate on Zoom is not exactly easy or effective, Mr. Speaker. This work, as the member has acknowledged, is complex. We don't deny it, but it's necessary. It's necessary if we are going to come to final reconciliation with Indigenous peoples across this province. We are doing the hard work. The federal government has joined with us. We intend to continue that work because British Columbians demand that we do so.
Member for Saanich North End Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Specklebelly lichen grow in old-growth trees in BC's coastal rainforests. 11 years ago, it was assessed by the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada as a species of special concern. This classification is in essence an amber alert, a signal that human activity is seriously threatening the survival of the species. We don't have our own species at risk legislation in British Columbia, but in 2017, our province signed a management plan allowing the federal government to take steps to ensure the survival of speckled-bellied lichen on BC's west coast. This plan commits to maintaining, quote, all known extant populations of this species. That means taking biodiversity into account in our forest management decisions. Last fall, I asked the Minister of Forest, Lands and Natural Resources how she will protect biodiversity in forestry when it's not included as an objective in the new forestry legislation. Through your Honourable Speaker, to the Minister, in the fall, the Minister told me that she believes biodiversity will be protected despite not being in the legislation. Now that the law has passed, how can we count on it to protect valuable populations such as the speckled-bellied lichen?
Minister of Forests and Lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question, and I recognize his passion about the issue with the speckle belly, and I know my staff are working with him and his folks on that issue because we know how important it is, and we know how important it is to the people of the province. We know how important the biodiversity is to the people of the province and the ecosystem in the forests, and that is why we are committed to it. That's why we have committed to it. That's why we are committed to ensuring that we are going to look at all 14 recommendations of the Old Growth Strategic Review, which includes the incredible biodiversity of our forests, ensuring that we are saving that. We are moving forward with that and working every day to ensure we're doing just that.
Member for Saanich North End Islands, supplemental.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And of course, the speckled belly lichen is just one of many species in our province that are endangered or have a threat of being extirpated. The minister committed in the debate last fall at committee stage that the amended forestry legislation would indeed protect biodiversity, even though biodiversity is not mentioned in the legislation. We're hearing from First Nations and scientists that endangered species in our province do not have the level of protections that's needed. The First Nations Leadership Council recently passed a resolution calling on the provincial government to enact a new law for biodiversity and ecosystem health. They've advocated directly to the minister and her colleague, the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, on this. At the same time as that advocacy was ongoing, logging in TFL 46, where one of the few remaining extant populations of old-growth speckle belly lichen was being extirpated, was ongoing there. Through you, Honourable Speaker, to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change strategy. Despite his colleague's commitments last fall, we continue to see this government's management practices threaten endangered species. Will the minister finally listen to First Nations and scientists and advocates and table our own species at risk legislation or biodiversity legislation?
Minister of Forests and Lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I just want the member to know one of the issues that we are dealing with First Nations is working together with them on issues of biodiversity and ecosystem health. We are working with them when it comes to the old growth deferrals by saying to them, you know, what issues are in your traditional territories, because that's what's really important, working with the rights and title holders in their traditional territory to ensure that we are looking at the biodiversity, the ecosystem health of those areas. And those nations have come forward and they've been very clear about areas that they want to make sure are deferred, areas they feel have already been deferred and have already been working on those areas. We are really respecting and using and working with those nations to ensure that we can do that across the province because we recognize the importance of this issue.
Member for Cariboo North.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. There's a pattern here. We have a minister that repeats, stands up, says we're going to do this, but then doesn't follow through with any sort of action. So under this government and under this minister, we are seeing that companies are cutting production, they're moving production, and they're actually investing in production outside of this province. This minister said that she would have workers' backs. Surrey-based Teal Jones describes the complete disarray, saying, and I quote, that uncertainty and repeated failure of BC government to follow their own rules unless ordered to by the courts was what compelled Teal Jones to invest in mills where they are more reliable and predictable, end quote. Under this minister, you have increased uncertainty. It has increased in loss of jobs. You have stood in this House and you have said that you have workers' backs. Will the minister stop and actually talk to workers, First Nations, and employers about building up an industry and instead of shipping those jobs down south?
Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. And I don't think I need to remind her that under her government's watch, 30,000 people lost their jobs, and you say, here we go? The member opposite says, that the acting House Leader says, here we go, as if it meant nothing to those people, nothing to those workers. Well, we are doing something. We are making sure. Unlike the opposition, we are not abandoning workers. We are ensuring that impacted workers and communities are provided the supports that they need. And we are bringing together coordinated and comprehensive supports for workers, for communities, First Nations. We've put out an initial $19 million for this fiscal year. And the member laughs. $19 million is significant for those workers who could potentially be losing their jobs. We're providing supports.
Members will come to order. Members, Minister will continue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are providing those supports. We are providing supports till the end of this fiscal year, and we will provide supports after. And it's interesting that they talk about the investments, because there's been considerable investments in this province, which they seem to forget about because they didn't have much investments in the province when they were government. So, despite their rhetoric, they might be surprised to learn that investments in forestry have increased by over 30% under our government. And the latest numbers, and these are Stats Canada, these aren't my numbers, these are Stats Canada, so hopefully the members will take those to heart. The latest numbers show that the annual private sector investments are up by over $500 million since 2016. $500 million.
Member for Caribou North.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, perhaps the minister would like to talk to some of the workers and small businesses that are here in the gallery today. I wonder if they have been able to access any of these investments that the minister talks about. I wonder if the minister has actually gone out and talked to communities and found out how workers are actually accessing these funds that the minister likes to talk about. All talk, no action. I have heard this minister rise in this House before and repeat the same notes in hers, but let's be clear, under the BC Liberals and under the BC Jobs Plan, the four sectors saw an addition of 10,000 jobs, all of which we've seen lost under the NDP. And this minister just seems to be warming up. She stands up, she says, I'll be there for workers, and meantime, I've talked to the workers, and I can share with the minister that they're deeply troubled by what this government is doing and the impact it is having. In the gallery today, we have Bill Dumont, Rona Doucette, and Bob Brash, and they're hoping for answers, Mr. Speaker. They're hoping for some assistance, not just talking points. Bob Brash is with the Truck Loggers Association, who wants to work with this government to create jobs, support workers, their families, and support the environment. But the NDP isn't listening. Instead, they have, and I quote, set in motion an unprecedented level of uncertainty and concern that is already having a significant impact on those whose livelihoods are at stake without information about what is next, end quote. Will the minister match her words with actions, pause her scheme, and actually work with groups to create a future for forestry in British Columbia instead of sending those jobs south to Louisiana?
Minister of Forests and Lands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And just to clarify for the record, the majority of the jobs went to Louisiana under their jurisdiction, not ours. Yeah. And we have been talking to workers. We have been talking to industry. We have been talking to unions. We've been talking to people, and I've spent some time talking to Bob Brash as well and the people in his organization. And we are working with them, and that, because of that input we have received from them, we are putting the supports in place in case they lose their jobs, in case they want to remanufacture their equipment, in case they want to look at new opportunities. We are providing them those opportunities. And I will remind the member, this is not my scheme. This is done because of the Old Growth Strategic Review, which I'm pretty sure members opposite supported. If I forget, I mean, if they didn't support it, we need to know, do they not support all 14 recommendations of the Old Growth Strategic Review, which is what we are doing right now, which is what we are working towards. I mean, if the members don't support that, the members opposite, if you do not support the Old Growth Strategic Review, then you should stand up and say so, because we know that there could be impacts. So we
Members.
are putting...
Members,
So the member says tens of thousands of jobs, and the member is absolutely wrong. Absolutely wrong. We have support.
members will come to order now.
We have supports in place, and we will have further supports in place. Stay tuned.
Member for Caribou-Chilcotin.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. By the minister's own account, she has admitted that there will be thousands of jobs lost under these plans. Working people like Tamara Maggot and Henry Mackelson, right up above you in the gallery, are representing people working in mills or in the bush, and they're worried about the lack of direction from the NDP. Employers are expressing their concern with the high costs and instability created by the NDP by moving investments to other jurisdictions. First Nations are also confused as to what the plan is. Chief Bill Williams of the BC First Nations Forestry Council says, and I quote, Mr. Speaker, "This seems like a box-ticking exercise by the government. BC rammed through significant changes to the forestry legislation through Bills 23 and 28 without any meaningful First Nation participation." Mr. Speaker, damning words from First Nations leadership in this province. This government lacks a plan to secure a strong forest industry. Will the minister actually talk to the people that are directly impacted by this and work with them?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And you know, we have been talking to people since 2017, and I appreciate that there's members in the gallery here today. And I also want to acknowledge that they were going to have a big rally here in front of the legislature, and they let me know that they decided not to do it out of respect for the people of Victoria, because they said they thought they'd had enough with honking horns and people protesting. So I want to thank them for that consideration, because I know how important this is to them. I know the passion they feel about this, because I too went through, I live in a forestry town, and I too went through seeing the loss of jobs under the previous government and saw absolutely no support for the people that worked in the forest industry. You know, I saw people who lost their jobs. I saw people who had to move. I don't know how many people I know in the Kootenays alone that had to move to Alberta to get work and are finally starting to come back home. So I know what it feels like, but we are not going to abandon these workers. We are there for them.
Members.
So we know that we have $19 million for this year, that people that feel that they are that have issues with anything to do with their employment, under issues that are affected by the Old Growth Strategic Review, that they will be able to retrain for jobs, they will be able to look at jobs. We are looking at, you know, one of the programs that we introduced under former Minister Doug Donaldson was the Bridging to Retirement. It was oversubscribed, Mr. Speaker. So we are also doing that, and there are people who are already coming forward. And the reason, you know what's interesting, they're coming forward because they want to bridge to retirement so younger people can continue to work, which is what is happening. And I want to give kudos to those people who said, we're ready to retire, we need some help to bridge, we're going to do that. And I want to thank the Minister of Labour for the work they're doing on this. We have considerable supports in place, and we'll have more supports in place. Stay tuned.
Member for Caribou-Chilcotin, supplemental.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. All the flowery language from the minister isn't going to put food on the table of forest workers in this province. The minister seems to be completely ignoring one simple fact, Mr. Speaker, and that is no one thinks her plan is a good one. Telling workers like the ones in the gallery today to just trust us doesn't work anymore, Mr. Speaker. Employers want certainty and stability and are going elsewhere to find it. First Nations want real consultation and partnerships, not box ticking by the NDP. Will the minister admit that making it up as she goes along simply isn't working anymore?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I want to, maybe the members didn't hear, we just recently announced a agreement between the Nanawakalis, which is 4 Nations, and Western Forest Products, where they agreed to defer critical biological old growth forests within their area on Vancouver Island. Working together, they were able to mitigate any job losses. Any job losses. We have also been talking to Indigenous nations who say they are looking forward to ensuring that their members are more engaged in the forest industry if they aren't already, or if they are, to continue to be engaged in the forest industry. But what they also said, Mr. Speaker, they are really looking forward to working with their neighbours and the communities they're in, working with the existing people that are working in the forest industry, working with loggers, working with truck loggers from Bob Brash's organization, working with people like Tamara and her family, so that they can work together so Indigenous nations get a fair share of our forest industry. So workers, communities, people in this province get a fair share of our forest industry. Sorry, I can't quite remember the word the member used, but I think he said it sounded like peanuts or something. We are spending $19 million just in this thing. Did you just say whoop-de-doo-dah? Sorry. The member for Kamloops said whoop-de-doo-dah. We are investing
Opposition
$19
House
million
Leader.
to support people, to ensure they have jobs, something that member knows nothing about because they